Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to study the Navi, the Prophet Zechariah, chapter 12. Today, this is Saul Weinreb, the host for the podcast. We are approaching the end of Zechariah, but we are going to be studying in these next three chapters some very, very powerful, very important and inspiring ideas, famous ideas. So let's head into chapter 12. Just by way of introduction, I want to remind you that in the last chapter, chapter 11, we learned of two ro'im. We're going to get back to ro'im, not in today's chapter, but in 13 and 14. And we're going to get back to some of the ideas that we expressed in the last one, chapter 11. So it's not over, but we just want to set up the fact that God had set up two ro'im, two shepherds. He ended with the ro'eh avili, right, or the ro'eh elilim, the foolish one, or the evil ro'eh shepherd. That God said this evil shepherd is going to not tend his flock, not take care of his sheep, not do his job as a leader, but rather he is going to lead them towards destruction. He's going to abandon his sheep, and he's going to end up becoming destroyed himself. That is the ro'eh ha'elil, the ozvi hatzon, the one who abandons his sheep, abandons his flock. And this, as we'll see further developed in today's chapter, is the leaders of those who refuse to humble themselves before God, those who refuse to take responsibility for their actions, refuse to join in the ultimate redemption. And instead of joining in the redemption when it comes, they are going to be the ones that lead the fight against it. And their end will not be good. The other ro'eh, God asks his prophet to lead, and then God said that if you, as people, do not take the mantle of leadership and lead the people properly towards redemption, then I'm going to have to do it myself. And God will lead us with the two sticks, with both reward and with punishment. Reward when we act good and punishment when we don't. But God would rather have us produce leaders from among ourselves so that we can lead ourselves in the right directions towards redemption and towards God. That's where we left off in the last chapter. Now God starts off with masa. Again, the language of a masa. Masa, which is generally translated as an announcement of sorts, but it also here means I've been translating also as a burden, because the ideas expressed here are a burden to whoever it is that it's being spoken to, a burden in the sense of it's a responsibility. It's a yoke. We need to listen to these words, take it to heart, and it creates a collective responsibility among all of the people that are the subjects of this prophecy, which means us, all human beings. And this specifically is a burden, Dvar Adonai al Yisrael, is a burden of God towards Israel, towards the Jewish people. Of course, there's a Masa'ot we saw in Yeshayahu, specifically towards all the nations, but also, most importantly, towards Israel, because the people of Israel were the ones that were given this information and given this task of bringing God's presence into this world. No'om Adonai, this is what God says. Which God? Not teshamayim v'yosei haaretz. The God who stretched out the skies above our heads and established and built the land beneath our feet. V'yotzer ruach adam b'kirbo. And then within that world that he created the spirit of man within it. So it's that God. He's the one that speaks. He's the one who is saying the following thing. Hinei anochi, behold, I, God, som es Yerushalayim. I'm going to create Jerusalem as a saf ra'al. A saf ra'al is you could say like a boiling pot, but ra'al is not so much boiling, but a pot that is stirred up and shaking. L'chol ha'amim soviv, for all of the nations around it. Jerusalem will be the center which is shaking everything up. Everyone is directed towards Jerusalem, either for good or for bad. In other words, all of these nations are going to come upon Jerusalem in a attempt to take it over, to control it. Their desire will be to control it rather than to submit to it, to submit that what Jerusalem represents, which is the authority of God, and the humility that comes along when someone submits himself to God. V'gamal Yehuda yeva matzora al Yerushalayim, and in this siege that will be laid upon Jerusalem by many of these countries. Now, this war against Jerusalem of the future has been predicted by most all of the prophets. Clearly, Ezekiel had the war of Gog and Magog, which is probably the most famous. But we had this idea expressed in Isaiah. We had this idea expressed in many other places. So Zechariah is simply putting his take on the same theme, the same idea, that the peoples of the world, at least many of the peoples of the world that refuse to humble themselves, will camp against Jerusalem. And even upon Yehuda, there will be those that are in this attack or in this siege that will be laid against Jerusalem. Now, there's three ways to understand this. Most of the traditional commentaries understand that as these nations come and pass through Judah, the land of Judah, on their way to the capital, they will take captives from the cities in Judah and force them to fight in the fight against their own capital. That's one way of understanding it, that there will even be Judeans being used in that fight. We know that the Romans definitely enslaved Jews and enlisted them to fight their brethren who were still fighting. With this tactic is unfortunate and extremely difficult for the people involved. But so that's one way of understanding this. So that they're saying that they're going to use this tactic. Another way of understanding this, though, is saying that maybe some people of Judah will actually join the attack, maybe willingly join the attack on Jerusalem. It's definitely possible that some people will think that these armies of the world are so much more powerful and strong. We should be fighting with them and not fighting with our brethren that are holding out in Jerusalem. And a third way of understanding it is that maybe what this means is that Gam al Yehuda, not only will they be laying siege against Jerusalem, but this attack will also be against the other towns in Yehuda. So this would not have Judeans fighting along with the enemies, either willingly or unwillingly, but rather it has all of Judah being subjects of this attack. This third pshat, this third explanation that I'm using, is not generally found in the traditional commentaries, but it does later on seem to fit a little better with some of the verses we're about to read. But all three things that I mentioned are possible ways of interpreting this verse. So let's go to verse 3. V'haya vayomahu, it will be on that day in the future when all of this is happening. God's presence is in Jerusalem, and the nations of the world are attacking it. The nations of the world don't like this. So Asim et Yerushalayim, I'm going to make Jerusalem, before God said I'm going to make Jerusalem a safra'al, a boiling or a reeling bowl, but I'm also going to make it an even ma'amasa, a stone which needs to be lifted. This immediately, l'chol ha'amim, for all the nations, it will be a stone, it will be a burden that the entire world just wants to get rid of. The world wants to just lift up Jerusalem. It's a giant worldwide headache. It's impossible not to imagine our time today and many times in the world where Jerusalem was just this gigantic headache. The status of Jerusalem is one of those things that everyone in the world needs to solve, but no one has a good solution for. But this stone also brings back the image, the famous image that we know from Genesis 29, verse 10, where Jacob encountered the stone that was on top of the well, and Rachel and the other women needed help to remove the stone, that this Evan, that stone, that Jacob was able to move, but everyone else, the entire world was trying to remove that stone, remove that obstacle between the women that needed it and the water that they needed. This Jerusalem, it becomes this obstacle between the people and God, and only what we're about to read will actually remove that obstacle and bring people closer to God. Kol omseha sorot yisaretu. All of those that are trying to lift her will get cut up and injured and hurt, because they're trying desperately to remove Jerusalem as an obstacle, so to speak. V'nesvu alel kol goyei haaretz, and all of the nations of the world are going to gather against Jerusalem because it's so difficult to conquer. It's so difficult to get rid of this giant obstacle, but they're going to get hurt while they try. By Homahu, on that day, Noam Adonai, says God, when the entire world is trying to remove Jerusalem, Akech chosus batimahon, I am going to cause every horse to be struck with craziness. The horses will go crazy. In other words, rather than fight them with bigger and stronger horses and tanks and might, I'm just going to cause their entire system to go haywire. The horses will go bonkers. They'll get some kind of illness and go crazy. V'rochvo bashigaon, and the riders, they're also going to go crazy. They're going to go nuts. They're just going to lose their ability to fight. V'al beis Yehuda, and on the house of Yehuda, and this is referring to all of the house of Yehuda, regardless of which pshat, which explanation we learned in verse 2. Either the people the people living in Jerusalem, of course, it includes, but it also includes those that are fighting with the enemy, whether they're fighting willingly or not, or it could mean all of the other cities besides Jerusalem. But since they are part of Judah, efkachet einai, I will open my eyes, I will pay attention to them. V'chol suso amim, while all of the horses, which represents, as we've seen repeatedly in Zechariah, the horses represents the war and might and power of ha'amim, of the nations, akeba ivaron, I will strike them with blindness. V'amru alufei Yehuda belibam, and those tribes of Yehuda will say in their heart, these tribes are one of those three possibilities, either the tribes fighting against their will with the enemy, or the tribes of Judah fighting willingly alongside the enemy, or the tribes of Judah that are outside Jerusalem also fighting against the enemy. But those tribes will say, Am soli yoshvei Yerushalayim. Those residents of Jerusalem have been a strength for me. They have been a strength for me because ba'adonai tzvos alehem, because they have been faithful to the Lord God, their God. They will learn those others that are not in Jerusalem, that are not as close to God. Being in Jerusalem represents those that are close to the temple, those that are closer to God. These other members of Judah will see that they have been a strength for us. Those that have been close to God have been a strength for us, and therefore we should join them and not stay with the enemy. Bayomahu, at that time, God says in verse 6, Asim et alufei Yehuda, I will make all of the tribes of Judah, all of them, Kichiyor eish be'etzim, they will be like a vessel of fire as it touches wood, which the wood gets burned really quickly. Chalapid eish, and is like a flame, like a flaming torch. Ba'amir, in a pile of dry stalks of grain. So these are things that burn quickly. Yehuda will just touch them, and the enemy will just be destroyed. V'achlu al yaminus al small, and they will destroy their enemies to the right and to the left. As kol ha'amim saviv, all of the nations that are surrounding Jerusalem and laying siege. V'yashva Yerushalayim od tachta b'Yerushalayim, and then Jerusalem shall rest and remain in her place right there in Jerusalem. The entire siege will just disappear and dissipate. It will be completely lifted and gone as the enemy will be destroyed. And God will first rescue not the kings, not Jerusalem, the capital itself, but those tribes that were outside. Now we understand and learn what the emphasis was. Why did we care so much about these tribes of Judah that were outside, either ones fighting with the enemy, whether willingly or not, or whether we're talking about the other tribes that were fighting against the enemy, but they were scattered in the fields, scattered in the small towns, in the hills of Judea. God will save them first. Why? Leman lo tigdal tiferes beis David, so that the glory of the house of David, the king, the house of the king who resides in Jerusalem himself, won't think too much of himself, won't be so haughty. And I would like you to think back to a moment to the events that occurred that were recounted in the book of Isaiah and the king Hezekiah, the king Chizkiyahu. If we remember, the country of Assyria had come and destroyed all of the land, all of the towns, the strong towns of Judah, and finally laid siege against the capital. And eventually God chose to save the capital, Jerusalem, and leave King Chizkiyahu, King Hezekiah, in place by a miracle which decimated the Assyrian army, and the Assyrian army had to retreat and leave, saving Jerusalem for the future. And Chizkiyahu at that time became arrogant. The first thing he did was that King Hezekiah showed off his wealth and his riches to other countries, almost taking credit for himself for his own arrogance. And if we recall when we studied this together, Isaiah was so disappointed at how the king reacted. So when the Alufei Yehuda, the tribes fighting out there, are decimated, but the king holds strong, there's two things that one can imagine. One can think, well, this means that I, the king, and my capital are strong and mighty, and therefore we will never be conquered, which unfortunately was the conclusion that Chizkiyahu made. Or one can come to the conclusion that God is preserving his kingdom, and one can be humble. But what God says, I'm not making that mistake over here, Zechariah says. In the future, it's going to be the little tribes, the guys out there. It's not going to be the capital city that holds up and wins. It's going to be the small towns, the small tribes, the tribes that were taken against their will to fight for the enemy. They're going to turn on the enemy, and they're going to be the ones that create the victory. So that L'ma'an lo tigdal teferet beis David, so that the house of David shouldn't be so haughty and think that they were the great ones that won this battle. V'teferet Yoshev Yerushalayim al Yehuda. We don't want that the residents of Jerusalem should think that they're any better than the ones that are outside. Think today about how often we see this, how the people that live in the big communities where they have everything they want, everything they need, we're the strong, we're the big, we're the mighty, we're the powerful. But the people that are out there struggling to maintain their religion, struggling to maintain their Judaism, in places where they're out there, they fight the fight every day, whether it's a fight of maintaining religion, maintaining connection, maintaining learning, maintaining brotherhood amongst the other Jews that are out where the people are. Those people, Zechariah is talking about them. He's saying the victory will come not from the great big cities with the large communities and the hundreds of synagogues and so on. The victory that's not where it comes from. The victory comes, because that leads to haughtiness. The victory comes from those few people that are scattered out there, the few people that have to fight the fight when they're not in the capital. Those that retain their connection to God when they're out there, that's where the victory comes from. And that's why it's so important, because of this idea of humility. Bayomahu, on that day, Yagein Adonai B'ad Yoshev Yerushalayim. Once the people that then live in Jerusalem understand that humility, that's when God will then protect Jerusalem. V'haya hanichshol bohem bayomahu, and then even the weakest among them, even the smallest among them, will be ki David, will be proud and strong, as if they themselves were the king's family. Uveis David ke Elohim. And then the house of David will then be like a god. This does not mean like a god, of course, a god with powers. Kelohim means a court. They will be the ones that lead in a way of justice, in a way of kindness, in a way of empathy for their people. Right? Kimalach Adonai lifneim. They will lead as if they were an angel of God before the people. When all of the people see that the strength comes from them, not the house of David, then the house of David will lead in a godly way, in a beautiful way, in a fair way, in an empathetic way. V'haya bayomahu, and it will be on that day, as we see the destruction is coming. Avakesh lahashmiras kol hagoyim haboim al Yerushalayim. It will be my desire. I will then begin and attempt to and begin to destroy all of those nations that attacked Jerusalem. Now it's time, and I saved Jerusalem. Now it's time for the ones that attacked, the ones that refuse to be humble. I am going to destroy them. V'shafachti al beis David. But instead of this incredible destruction happening and mass death, it's not exactly what's going to happen. Because v'shafachti, this is verse 10, al beis David, I will pour into the house of David, v'al Yoshev Yerushalayim, and all of those that are the residents of Jerusalem, not a spirit of vengeance, not going to give them the strength and the power of mighty horses to attack and destroy the enemy, but I'm going to give them ruach chen v'tachanunim, a spirit of grace. Chen is grace. Chen is what someone has when he's beloved by other people, when other people look at him and say, I love you, I enjoy you, I want you to be with me, I want to learn from you, I want to be like you. That's ruach chen. V'tachanunim means prayer, means mercy on others. The people are going to feel the desire and the need not to destroy the others, but to pray for them. V'hibitu elai es asher dakaru. And all of those people that have been stabbed and killed, this refers to both the enemies, and I know there's various ways to read this, but just reading the language itself, they, meaning all of those in this battle that have been dakaru, that have been pierced by the sword, that have been injured, that have been hurt by this war, that means both the people of Judea, both the Jews that have been hurt in battle, because even on the victorious side there will be injured, but even those on the enemy side that have been injured and hurt, hibitu elai, they are all going to look to me for mercy. But I am going to place in the Beit David, in the house of David and the people of Jerusalem, a spirit of mercy, a spirit of prayer, and v'safdu alav, and they are going to be sofed, they are going to wail and cry over him. This is a very odd word. It's safdu, and they will be sofed, they will be wailing alav, on him. Now what does it mean on him? It's aleihem. Es asher dakaru, the people that have been pierced. There's thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people that have been hurt and harmed in this huge battle. So what does it mean, safdu alav? The verse continues and explains to us what does it mean on him. Kimispeid al hayachid. When they cry, they're not going to cry over tens of thousands of casualties and look up the casualty numbers, but they're going to cry over each and every one who is an individual. It's so important, and we talk about this when we think about mass numbers. 6 million people killed in the Holocaust. You get lost in these massive numbers, but when you're reminded to yourself that each and every one was a human being with a story, with a life, with people who loved him, who loved her, people that she loved, that he loved, people and aspirations and dreams that were never fulfilled. Each and every one, they will cry. This is what the people of Jerusalem are going to do. They're not going to wage war and smash their enemies, but they're going to have a ruach chen v'tachanunim, and they're going to pray for them, and they're going to cry for them. All of them, v'homer alav, and they will be bitter over him, over each one individual, kihomer al bukhar, as if they had the same kind of bitterness that one has when their firstborn child passes away. Bayomahu, it is on that day when the ruach chen v'tachanunim spreads across the people of Jerusalem, Yigdal HaMispeid B'Yerushalayim, then the wailing and the crying will be tremendously great over the entire Jerusalem. Kimispad Hadad Rimon Bevikat Megidon, similar to the crying that occurred of the Hadad Rimon story and the one that occurred in Bekat Megidon. I'm going to go with Rashi's explanation. Hadad Rimon was the one who killed Achav, Ahab, the king in northern Israel, and the people had a tremendous wailing and crying and has paid him for Achav. And Bekat Megidon is where the king Josiah, the king Yoshiyahu, was killed in battle in the famous Vayikonein Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu, where we know that Jeremiah eulogized and cried over the loss of Josiah. So these were both times when we cried over a specific individual or a specific leader who was dear, at least Achav was at least dear to his people in a certain level, even though he was an evil man. And Yoshiyahu was dear to God, dear to his people. So this crying, each and every one of the dead from this massive battle, the people will cry over them as individuals. And then it says, V'saftaha aretz mishpachos levad, families, each family will cry on their own together. So it's emphasizing how is it that when one has cries over an individual, how does it happen that you cry over an individual and realize that they're a person when the families recognize who they lost? Families know and understand he wasn't just casualty number 604. He was our cousin. He was our friend. He was the woman that passed away from all kinds of suffering that went through the terrible suffering. She's not just our mother. She's our mother. She's not just a random number 703. This mishpachos levad, mishpachas Beis David, even the wealthy king's families, the house of David alone, u'neshehem levad, and their women crying alone, because of the attachments of families, especially in those days. Women had their relationships, men had their relationships, all crying in a unique, special way. Mishpachas Beis Nason Levad, the house of Nathan, Neshem Levad. These are all families that were prominent families in the days, and their wives alone. Mishpachas Beis Levi Levad, the house of the Levites alone, Neshehem and their wives Levad alone. Mishpachas Beis Hashimi Levad, the family of Shimi, Neshem Levad. Listing families so that you should know that we're talking about individual families, each and every family crying over its own. Kol hamishpachos hanisharos, all of the remaining families that are still around at this time. Mishpachos levad, again saying families together, and Neshem levad, and their women all together, each one mourning their losses in their own personal way. This is ruachein v'tachanunim, the kind of ruachein v'tachanunim which recognizes that wars are not counted in how many millions or how many thousands of people died in battle and just chalking it up on a list. But battles, and the result of battles is many, many, many individuals lost, people, human beings, each one with a story, each one with something that was cut off too early, each one with a loss, especially to their families, but to all of us who have lost the potential for what that person could have and should have had the opportunity to contribute to our world. This is the end of chapter 12. Thank you so much for studying chapter 12 with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 13 and 14 and this entire wonderful book of Zechariah together.